The microphone felt cold in my hand, a stark contrast to the warmth of the spotlights on my face. Thousands of eyes stared back at me, a sea of admiration and expectation. In the front row, him, my father, Julian. His smile was a beacon of pride, the king being celebrated by his court. They were all waiting for words of love, the tribute from a devoted daughter to New York's greatest philanthropist. I took a deep breath. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, broken only by the distant clink of a champagne flute. They wanted a fairy tale. I was about to give them a coroner's report. My thumb found the small button on the remote in my hand. One click. Behind me, on the giant screen where a montage of his good deeds was supposed to play, a sharp image appeared. It wasn't a family photo. It was an old bank statement. Lines upon lines of transactions, culminating in a single massive transfer to a shell corporation. His name, his unmistakable signature, glowed like a branding iron. He was the first to understand. Julian's smile didn't vanish. It froze, a wax mask that began to melt under the weight of what he saw. A murmur swept through the room, a shockwave that grew into a buzz of confusion and horror. The cameras, once focused on my face, instinctively swung towards his. They look at me now, searching my eyes for the rage of a betrayed daughter. They won't find it. What they see, and what terrifies them, is the calm, the precision. This isn't an act of passion. It's an act of justice. They will judge me for destroying a god. They don't know that to dethrone a false god, sometimes you have to become a devil. The story behind this act will shock you. To be the first to discover every secret of this revenge, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The truth is so much worse. The press devoured the story. In less than 24 hours, I became the most hated woman in the country. The tabloids christened me with cruel nicknames: the Park Avenue Serpent, the Fallen Angel. My motives, according to them, were obvious: greed, a pathological envy, the fury of a slighted woman who could never match her father's greatness. They painted a portrait of a corporate Medusa, cold and calculating, turning her own creator's legacy to stone. I read every word, saw every report, and I said nothing. I let them build my pedestal of infamy, brick by brick. The truth is, the world needs monsters. It simplifies things. And I was the perfect monster for their story. What they didn't report, what they could never know, was the Claire that existed before. The 19-year-old girl with a scholarship to study art history in Florence, dreaming of a life among books and ruins, as far as possible from the false glitter of Julian's empire. I remember the day he asked me to stay. We were in his office, the scent of mahogany and power thick in the air. "Your mother isn't well, Claire. I need you by my side, just for a little while." His time, his measurement of time, a time that stretched into 15 years. That little while was my youth. I traded Caravaggio's canvases for Excel spreadsheets. I exchanged nights in libraries for sleepless nights in boardrooms, fixing his impulsive mistakes. How many times did I renegotiate a contract his arrogance nearly destroyed? How many times did I soothe an investor he insulted in a fit of rage? How many times did I lie to my own mother, telling her he was in a business meeting when the champagne bill from some luxury suite exposed his absence? I was more than his heir. I was his crisis manager, the silent guardian of his secrets, the invisible architect of the perfect image he sold to the world. Every humanitarian award he held, every magazine cover he graced, had my fingerprints on its foundation. I polished the gold of his statue while the rust ate away at my soul. I wasn't an innocent victim. I was an accomplice, complicit in my silence, in the blind loyalty we call a daughter's love. I chose to believe in the facade, chose to ignore the whispers in my own heart telling me something was deeply wrong. Every lie I told to protect him was also a lie I told to myself. So when the world called me cold and calculating, I accepted it. They were right, but for all the wrong reasons. The cold wasn't born from a lack of love. It was born from a surplus of it. The calculation didn't come from greed. It came from the need to survive the fire he had started. They knew me as the woman who endured everything in silence, the quiet pillar beside the great Julian Croft. They were about to discover the terrifying noise my silence could make. They think I wanted his throne, that I coveted the name, the power, the empire built on foundations I myself had helped to shore up. Their logic is simple, primitive. You kill the king to take the crown. It's a narrative the world understands, one that comforts them. The truth, however, is far more complex. I didn't want his crown. I just wanted to be able to visit my mother's grave in peace. My mother, Beatrice. To the world, she was the tragic, beautiful wife of Julian Croft, an ethereal figure of fragile health and a delicate mind, who succumbed to a deep melancholy and left us too soon. That was the official story. The eulogy my father carved in marble and repeated in every interview. The beloved wife, the tormented soul. He was the stoic widower, the man who carried his grief with heroic dignity, a saint. But the Beatrice who lives in my memory, the one I visit in my dreams, wasn't fragile. She was a force of nature. She had a laugh that filled the house, and a mind sharper than any executive my father ever hired. It was her family's money that started the company. It was her vision that drew up the first expansion plans. In the early years, she was the one working late in the office, while my father was the social face, the charming host. I remember watching her bent over the ledgers, with an energy that seemed bottomless. Then, slowly, the light began to dim. It started with my father dismissing her concerns. "Leave this to me, my love. You seem tired." He said it with such care, such concern, that it seemed like an act of love. Then came the comments to friends, whispered with false resignation. "Beatrice has been so forgetful lately. She's been having some exotic ideas. I think the pressure is getting to her." He was an artist of slow poisoning, a master of soul erosion. He didn't break her with one blow. He dissolved her, day by day, with homeopathic doses of doubt, isolation, and condescension. And the worst part, I believed him. I, her daughter, became a small gear in the machine grinding her sanity. I saw her moments of fury and called them episodes. I heard her suspicions about partners and transactions and called it paranoia. I watched her waste away and called it sadness. When he finally had her committed for the first time, for her own good, I held her hand and begged her to accept the help. I became my own mother's jailer, convinced the cell was for her protection. The guilt of that act, the memory of her eyes that day, is a debt I can never repay. My desire, therefore, wasn't a simple act of revenge. It was an attempt at resurrection. I needed the world to know who Beatrice really was. I needed them to hear her truth. The version that was suffocated under convenient diagnoses and pills prescribed by doctors who played golf with my father on Sundays. This desire had always been there, latent, an ember under the ashes of my loyalty to Julian. The ember became a wildfire the day I cleaned out her old closet. At the bottom of a hat box, I found her leather agenda. From the last year she was lucid. Between notes for dinners and charity events, there was something else. Names of companies I'd never heard of, strings of numbers, dates that coincided with my father's urgent business trips. This wasn't the diary of a depressed woman. These were the notes of an investigator. In that instant, desire became obsession. Justice for Beatrice was no longer a melancholy dream. It became the sole purpose of my life. I held the spark of her truth in my hands, but Julian was a god in his own universe. And gods don't just create, they erase. He had spent 2 decades building a fortress of lies. Every document that could incriminate him had been purged. Every person who knew too much had been bought or discarded. My mother's illness was a medical fact, sealed in reports and testimonies. How do you prove a murder of the soul when the murderer has convinced the entire world the victim slowly killed herself, right before everyone's eyes? The months following the discovery of the agenda were an exercise in futility. I felt like a ghost haunting my own father's life, searching for a door he had walled up 20 years before. I hired the best investigators money could buy. They sifted through Julian's past, dove into his businesses, but came back empty-handed. He was a master at covering his tracks. The companies my mother had noted were dissolved. The people mentioned had vanished or refused to talk, bought by his money or intimidated by his power. With every dead end, his fortress seemed more impenetrable, and my mother's voice grew more distant. Obsession was turning to despair. I had the melody of the crime, but I couldn't find the lyrics. I was trapped in limbo, between the truth I felt in my bones and the impossibility of proving it. The breaking point didn't come with a bang, but with the clinking of silver cutlery on a Sunday morning. It was the anniversary of the company's founding, and Julian had organized a brunch at his mansion for family and close friends. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the dining room in a hypocritical golden light. He was at the height of his performance, the benevolent patriarch, the impeccable host, dispensing smiles and hugs that didn't reach his eyes. I sat at the table, playing my role as the loyal daughter, a plastic smile on my face, while inside I counted every breath to keep from screaming. In the middle of dessert, he stood up, cleared his throat, and asked for everyone's attention. The room fell silent. His face took on an expression of deep, rehearsed solemnity. He spoke of legacy, of family, of the importance of giving back to the community. And then, he mentioned my mother. He spoke of her beauty, her sensitive soul, the darkness that took her. His eyes welled up right on cue. It was a masterpiece of acting. And then came the final blow. "That is why," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "in her honor, so that her struggle will not have been in vain, I have decided to create the greatest work of my life. Today, I am announcing the creation of the Beatrice Foundation, a sanctuary for women who, like my beloved wife, battle the shadows in their own minds." The world around me went silent. The sound I heard wasn't the emotional applause that followed. It was the sound of something inside me shattering forever, the sound of sacrilege. He wasn't just lying about her death, he was capitalizing on it. He had turned the cell where he tortured her into a monument to his own goodness. That wasn't a tribute. It was the final, most profane act of desecrating her grave. I excused myself from the table, bile rising in my throat. I needed air. I walked aimlessly through the corridors of that house. Every painting on the wall, every rug under my feet, a silent witness to my mother's suffering. I ended up in his library, the sanctuary of his ego, and that's where I saw them, on a prominent shelf, the collection of classic, leather-bound novels that had belonged to her. A trophy, a decoration. I approached, my rage giving me a strange clarity. I ran my fingers along the spines. Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina, Effie Briest, all stories of imprisoned women. One of them, the Scarlet Letter, seemed slightly out of place. I pulled it out. It was heavier than it should have been. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I took the book to his desk. With a silver letter opener, engraved with his initials, I slit the lining of the back cover. My fingers found not paper, but an oilskin packet. Inside, folded with a precision that defied time, was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a letter, it was a confession. Her handwriting, firm and lucid, filled the page. At the top, just 2 words, "My testament." I trembled as I unfolded it, and my eyes fell on the first sentence. "If you are reading this, it is because I am dead, and it was not by my own hand." My mother's handwriting in those 2 words, "My testament," was a scream that pierced through 2 decades of silence. The sentence that followed, "If you are reading this, it is because I am dead, and it was not by my own hand," was not just an accusation. It was a key that unlocked not only the mystery of her death, but also the door to a memory I had tried to keep sealed. The harsh light of that revelation blinded me to the library around me and threw me 6 months back in time, into the darkness of my father's office, to the night I was humiliated, the night the daughter inside me began to die. I had scheduled the meeting under the pretext of discussing the quarterly report. It was the only way to get an uninterrupted hour with him. His office was on the top floor, a pantheon of glass and steel overlooking the city that bowed at his feet. Everything there was designed to diminish whoever entered. The soaring ceilings, the mahogany desk the size of a car, the wall covered with awards and photos of him with important people. It was the lion's den, and I, a fool, had walked in unarmed, my only weapon my mother's leather agenda. He listened to me with the patience of a monarch, seated in his leather armchair that hissed softly when he moved. He watched me over his steepled fingers. There was a faint smile on his lips, the smile of an indulgent father listening to a child's fantasy. I placed the agenda on the polished desk. The small object looked pathetic, insignificant, on that altar of power. "Dad, I found this." My voice came out weaker than I intended. "It's Mom's notes from her last year. There are names in here, companies, numbers that don't make sense. I checked. They're shell corporations, all linked to offshore tax havens." He didn't touch the agenda. He just tilted his head, the smile never wavering. "Claire, my dear, your mother was a brilliant woman, but she was ill. Her mind created patterns, connections where there were none. It was part of her condition. She saw conspiracies everywhere. This isn't a conspiracy," I insisted, pushing the agenda an inch towards him. "This is an investigation. She was investigating you." That's when the smile faltered. For a millisecond, I saw something in his eyes. A glint, cold, predatory, metallic, but it was gone so fast I almost doubted myself. He stood, walked slowly to the crystal bar built into the wall, and poured himself a whiskey. The sound of ice hitting the glass was the only thing that broke the heavy silence. "You're exhausted, Claire," he said, his back to me, his voice now a concerned velvet. "You've been working too hard, taking on too much responsibility. This loyalty you have to your mother's memory, it's noble, but it's taking you to a dangerous place, a place of obsession." He turned, the glass in his hand. "You're starting to sound like she used to sound." At the end, those words were a punch to the gut. He wasn't just denying it, he was using my greatest pain, my deepest guilt, as a weapon against me. He was diagnosing me with the same madness he forced upon her. "I'm not crazy," I said, my chin trembling. "Of course not, darling. You're just confused." He came closer, perching on the edge of his desk, looming over me, a mountain. He placed his free hand on my shoulder. The gesture was meant to be paternal, but it felt like the weight of a tombstone. Beatrice used to say that too. She also thought she was perfectly lucid while she was drowning in her delusions. "I see the same fire in you, the same stubbornness, and it scares me. It truly scares me, because I couldn't bear to lose you too." The humiliation was a slow poison, spreading through my veins. He saw me not as an equal, not as a threat, but as a patient, a poor, hysterical girl who needed to be managed for her own good, the daughter who had inherited her mother's flawed character. I gathered what was left of my strength. "I'm going to find out the truth, with or without your help." The weight of his hand increased. The velvet in his voice vanished, replaced by a thread of steel. "No," he said, the word low and sharp. "You won't. You will take a long vacation. You will travel. You will clear your head. And when you come back, this fantasy will be over. Because if you keep digging, Claire, I don't know what you might find, and I don't know if I can protect you from it." It was a threat, wrapped in false concern. The final warning. He removed his hand from my shoulder, returned to his chair, picked up a pen, and looked down at some papers on his desk. With that simple gesture, he dismissed me. The conversation was over. I no longer existed. I was a fly he had swatted away with a wave of his hand. I sat there for a moment, invisible, silenced, annihilated. The humiliation was absolute. I had walked into his office as his daughter, seeking the truth. I left as a stranger, a potential lunatic. He hadn't just lied to me. He had tried to erase my reality, to rewrite my sanity, just as he had done with hers. I rose from the chair. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, distant and unsteady. I didn't take my mother's agenda from the desk. Leaving it there was my first act of war. Though I didn't know it yet, it was a trophy I allowed him to keep, so he would feel victorious, so he would underestimate me one last time. I walked towards the door, feeling his gaze on my back. A physical weight, cold and amused. Each step on the thick carpet was a monumental effort. The click of the door closing behind me sounded like the ceiling of a tomb. The anteroom to his office was obsequiously quiet. His two executive assistants, women who had watched me grow up, were absorbed in their computer screens, typing with a ferocity that fooled no one. They had heard. They always heard. But their faces were masks of professionalism. To them, I was already the unstable daughter, the next crisis to be managed. I crossed the executive floor, feeling the disguised glances follow me, the veiled pity and contempt. I was an anomaly, a defective part in the perfect machine that was Julian's world. The elevator arrived, its brushed steel doors opening like the mouth of a metallic whale. Inside, alone, the mask I wore began to crack. The mirrored walls reflected back an image I barely recognized. A pale woman, her eyes too large, her mouth a thin line of pain. But looking deeper, past my own face, I saw her, my mother. I saw the same haunted look, the same wounded confusion I remembered from her final days, and terror hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about fraud. It was a pattern, a method. He was a hunter, and his hunting ground was the souls of the women who loved him. He cornered them, isolated them, undermined their confidence, distorted their reality until they themselves believed in their own madness. He didn't break them. He convinced them to break themselves. The humiliation I felt in his office wasn't a spontaneous act of cruelty. It was a procedure. He was putting me on the same path he put Beatrice on. The diagnosis was already prepared. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, the bright light of the lobby felt like an assault. I walked out of the building and into the city night, an automaton moving through the indifferent crowd. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Crying was what he expected. Crying was a weakness he would know how to exploit. Crying was admitting defeat, accepting his diagnosis. A woman's tears, to men like my father, are not a sign of pain. They are a confession of hysteria. I got into my car and drove aimlessly for hours. The The city lights became neon blurs through the windshield. In my mind, I replayed the conversation. Again and again, but this time, the pain gave way to an icy clarity. I dissected his every word, not as a wounded daughter, but as a general studying the enemy's tactics, the false concern, the weaponization of my mother's name, the veiled threat. He had shown me his entire arsenal. He was so confident in his power, in my weakness, that he didn't bother to hide his weapons. He displayed them for me. And that was his first great mistake. The pain of humiliation didn't go away. It metamorphosed. It solidified. It ceased to be an open wound and became a suit of armor. Sadness turned into fuel. A daughter's love, that blind, unconditional loyalty, finally withered and died, leaving behind something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous: purpose. He wanted me to believe I was crazy. Fine, maybe crazy was exactly what I needed. Because a sane person would never have the courage to do what I knew I had to do. A sane person plays by the rules, and I finally understood. The rules were written by him, to ensure he always won. I arrived at my apartment as the city was beginning to quiet down. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the darkness of the living room, looking out the window at the skyline carved by the buildings. High above, shining brighter than all the others, was the light from his office, the King's Tower. Did I hate him in that moment? No. Hate was a hot, passionate emotion. What I felt was cold. It was a calculated emptiness. It was the calm that precedes the avalanche. He had judged me and sentenced me. He gave me my diagnosis. That night, I didn't cry. I accepted my illness, and I began to plan the cure. The morning light that came through my window the next day felt different. It wasn't warm. It was clinical, the light of an operating room. The city was waking up, ignorant of the war that had been declared in the darkness of my apartment. The planning began not with rage, but with a cold method. I took the yellowed sheet of paper, my mother's testament, and read it again. This time, not as a grieving daughter, but as a prosecutor reading her key exhibit. Every word was a clue, a thread to be pulled. She was smarter than Julian ever imagined. The letter was succinct, but devastating. It mentioned a name, Judith Adler. It mentioned a bank and the number of a safe deposit box, and the small brass key I found with the letter, a mystery until now, suddenly had a purpose. The first phase of my plan, therefore, wouldn't be an attack, but a silent reconnaissance. I needed eyes and ears that weren't my own. I needed a ghost. I spent the morning researching. Not on company computers, not on my cell phone. I went to an anonymous internet cafe downtown, a place that smelled of dust and static electricity. There, I found a name that surfaced in whispers in the darker corners of the internet, associated with billionaire divorces and corporate disappearances. Flynn, an old-school ex-cop, kicked off the force for insubordination, and now the most expensive and discreet private investigator in the country. The meeting was set in a noisy diner near the bus station. He was a man in his 60s, with a face like a map of every human disappointment, and eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. I placed a thick envelope on the table. Inside, an amount of cash that would make him listen, and the small brass key. "I don't want to know your name, and I don't want to know the story," he said, his voice like gravel. "I want to know what you want me to find. I want the contents of this box," I replied, quietly, "and I want you to find a woman. Judith Adler. I want to know everything about her. Where she lives, who she talks to, what she's afraid of." He took the envelope, feeling the weight of the cash. He said nothing more, just stood up and vanished into the crowd. I had moved my first pawn onto the board. While Flynn moved in the shadows, I focused on Judith. The mention of her name in my mother's letter was the most intriguing piece. I remembered her vaguely, from the stories my father told. The original partner, the talented friend who, according to him, couldn't handle the pressure, and chose a simpler life upstate. A story that now sounded as false as the one about my mother's illness. Flynn was faster than I expected. 3 days later, another envelope appeared under my door. Inside, a detailed report and a flash drive. Judith Adler lived in a small mountain town, 200 miles from the city, a recluse. No social life. Flynn's report also contained a bombshell. 25 years ago, she had sued my father, but the case was mysteriously dropped and the records sealed. The flash drive contained the contents of the safe deposit box. They were copies of original company documents, contracts, balance sheets from the founding era, documents that Beatrice, my mother, must have copied and hidden before Julian could purge them. I drove to Judith. I found her tending a garden in a modest house, surrounded by high walls. Time had been hard on her. There was a permanent fear in her eyes. When I introduced myself, she almost slammed the door in my face. "I have nothing to say to you. Not to Julian Croft's daughter." She spat the words like venom. "I'm not here as his daughter," I said, my voice steady. "I'm here as Beatrice's daughter." That stopped her. I showed her my mother's letter. Her eyes filled with tears as she read. For the first time, the fear in her face gave way to an old pain. She let me in. For hours she talked. She told the true story. How she and my father built the company together. How he cheated her in a brilliant and cruel financial maneuver, using the money to create a new company in his own name and leaving her with the debts of the old one. She told me how he threatened her, how he silenced her, ruining her reputation until no one would hire her again. And she told me how the only person who believed her was my mother. Beatrice had started investigating, putting the pieces together, and that was why Julian needed to neutralize her. The circle was closing. Judith's story was the original sin upon which my father's entire empire was built. The documents from the box were the technical proof. Her testimony was the soul of the accusation. The final step of my preparation was the most pragmatic. I knew that the moment I attacked, Julian would freeze all my assets. He would leave me with nothing. Over the next few weeks, under the guise of diversifying investments, I moved my personal wealth. I sold stocks, liquidated funds, transferred the money to secure accounts overseas, under a name he couldn't trace. I was building my ark, preparing for the flood I was about to cause. At the end of a month, the preparation phase was complete. My apartment had transformed into a war room. On the table, the complete dossier, Flynn's reports, the copies of Beatrice's documents, Judith's recorded statement, the proof of the financial fraud. My financial ark was ready. I had the weapons, the resources, and the allies. I looked at the photo of my father on the bookshelf, the two of us smiling on a boat years ago. The daughter in that photo was dead, and the woman who replaced her felt nothing, only the cold weight of strategy. The gathering of arms was over. Now, it was time to return to the battlefield, but not as a soldier, as a spy. At this point in my story, I was completely alone. If you've connected with my pain, tell me which city you're watching from. I read and replied to everyone. The first phase of a war is one far from the battlefield. It's one in the mind of the enemy. After weeks of a sepulchral silence, during which I communicated with my father only through curt and efficient corporate emails, I made the call. I dialed his private number on a Friday afternoon, the time I knew he'd be relaxed, savoring the week's victories. His voice when he answered was cautious, cold. "Dad?" I said, and the word felt strange in my own mouth. I injected a fragility I didn't feel into it, a hesitation that was pure performance. I wanted to apologize for my behavior these past few weeks. You were right. I was exhausted, obsessed. I wasn't thinking clearly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could picture him, leaning back in his armchair, analyzing my words, searching for the trap. "I took a few days off, like you suggested," I continued, before he could respond, "and it helped me see things more clearly. I'm so sorry. Truly, I just want things to go back to normal." The ice in his voice melted, replaced by a tone of victorious magnanimity. "I know, sweetheart. I know. I never doubted you. Sometimes we all get a little lost." He had won. The rebellious daughter had been tamed and was returning, tail between her legs, to the castle, exactly as I had planned. My transformation was immediate and total. I became the daughter he always wanted, the one I could never be. At work, I was a prodigy of efficiency and submission. I applauded his decisions in meetings, praised his genius to the directors, worked late to deliver impeccable reports that anticipated his needs. The problem daughter, the questioner, the heir with her own ideas, had vanished. In her place was a mirror that reflected his greatness. At home, the performance was even more intense. I organized Sunday dinners, invited his friends, listened to his repeated stories with a smile of admiration. I asked for his advice on trivial investments, on the color of a wall, on which wine to serve. I made myself small, docile, ornamental. I was the living proof of his power, the testament to his ability to shape the world, and people, to his will. At first he reveled in it. His arrogance, fed by my apparent defeat, became boundless. He relaxed. He lowered his guard. But then, subtly, I began to introduce the poison. It started with my gaze. In the middle of a dinner, while he was telling one of his anecdotes, I would stare at him, not with admiration, not with anger, with a calm, neutral observation. It was the gaze of an entomologist studying a rare insect. When he would trail off, suddenly uncomfortable, I would just smile and say, "Sorry, I was lost in your thoughts. Please, continue." Then came the memories. I would bring up the past in unexpected ways, like someone finding a forgotten object in a pocket. I was remembering the other day, that summer in the Hamptons. Mom's last summer. I'd say casually over coffee. She seemed so worried about those calls from the office. "Do you remember what they were about?" I never accused. I just planted the seed. The seed that I remembered everything. The seed that maybe I knew more than he imagined. He started watching me. Distrust, a sleeping animal, began to stir in his eyes. My serenity disturbed him. My perfect obedience put him on alert. He knew me. He knew this wasn't my nature. He could feel the dissonance, the wrong note in the symphony of his perfect life, but he couldn't find the source. He tested me, making jokes about my new Zen personality, or asking if I was really okay, and I answered every test with a performance of normality, so convincing it made him even more paranoid. I became an enigma in his own house. The final opportunity came when the company board proposed the grand gala event to honor him for his 30-year career. Before he could delegate the task, I volunteered. "Let me, Dad. I want it to be perfect. You deserve the best." He hesitated for a moment, distrust warring with vanity. Vanity won, entrusting me with the organization of his greatest night of glory would be the final proof of my restored loyalty. To him, it was his coronation. To me, it was total control of the scaffold. I chose the venue, approved the guest list, hired the film crew, supervised the setup of the screens. I built the theater for his judgment, and he paid me for it. On the night of the event, with everything in place, he knocked on my bedroom door. I was finishing getting ready, wearing a black dress, elegant and severe like an executioner's uniform. He held a velvet box in his hands. Inside, a diamond necklace, the same one that had belonged to my mother. "For my star of the night," he said, fastening the cold clasp around my neck. "I am so proud of you, Claire. So proud of the woman you've become." I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger to both of us. I smiled at him. A perfect smile, full of filial love. "I did it all for you, Dad." He took my arm, beaming. The king walking towards the apotheosis of his legacy. He thought my silence these last few months had been my surrender. In truth, it was the silence of a predator closing in on its prey. It was the calm before my storm. The car stopped before the red carpet, and the world exploded in light. Camera flashes popped like magnesium, a shower of artificial stars to greet the king's arrival. My father emerged from the car with the grace of a statesman, a wide smile on his face, his hand waving to the crowd of photographers and journalists screaming his name. I got out right behind him, my mother's diamond necklace cold against my skin, a frigid reminder of my purpose. To the world, I was his most beautiful trophy, the proof of his dynasty. To myself, I was the dagger he was smilingly carrying against his own chest. He took my arm as we walked, and the warmth of his hand felt like a stranger's touch. The ballroom was a spectacle of power. The air vibrated with the buzz of important conversations, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the scent of money and perfume. Politicians, judges, billionaires, the entire court was present. Every person in that hall was a pillar supporting Julian's temple, and I was there with a hammer in my hand, ready to strike the master beam. I smiled, shook hands, accepted compliments on the flawless organization of the event. Every smile was a lie. Every kind word was a tactical maneuver. My body was there, floating in a sea of silk and power, but my mind was elsewhere. It was in a control room, cold and silent, watching the monitors, waiting for the countdown to hit 0. The ceremony began. Speeches were made, each one more laudatory than the last. They projected a biographical video on the screen, a 20-minute hagiography that painted my father as a modern-day saint, scenes of him opening hospitals, hugging children, receiving international awards. The soundtrack was emotional. The narration was reverent. I looked at him, sitting beside me at the main table. He watched his own glorification with a single, perfectly timed tear rolling down his face. He believed it. He believed his own mythology. And in that moment, any remnant of doubt I might have had vanished. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a sociopath. Finally, the master of ceremonies announced my name. And now, to present the evening's main award, the person who knows him better than anyone, his biggest admirer, and the mind behind this magnificent event, his daughter Claire. The audience applauded. I stood, the fabric of my dress rustling softly. My father squeezed my hand, whispering, "Knock 'em dead, sweetheart." I smiled at him, a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I walked to the stage, each step firm, deliberate. The path seemed miles long. When I reached the podium, the silence in the hall was absolute. I adjusted the microphone. The lights were blinding, but I didn't see the audience. I saw only one target. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm, resonating through the hall. My father, Julian Croft, taught me many things. He taught me about ambition, about perseverance. He taught me the importance of building a legacy that outlasts a lifetime. I paused, looking directly at him. He beamed, his face swollen with pride. But the most important lesson I learned, not from him, but because of him, was about the hidden price of these legacies, what they must bury in order to rise. Click. Behind me, the screen changed. The smiling image of my father was replaced by the bank statement, the original sin, the proof of the fraud that started it all. "This document," I continued, my voice a scalpel, "shows the transaction that founded my father's empire. An embezzlement of funds from the company he co-owned with his first partner, a woman named Judith Adler, whom he left with all the debt and none of the equity." The murmuring began. Low, confused, Julian turned pale. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to scream it was a fake, but I gave him no time. Click. The screen split. On one side, a video appeared. The aged but dignified face of Judith Adler. It was a recorded statement, calm and detailed, where she told the story of the betrayal, corroborating every detail of the document. On the other side, copies of the original articles of incorporation appeared, his signature highlighted, the very documents my mother had hidden. "As you can see," I said, "we have the testimony and the material evidence, but what you are seeing is not the story of a financial crime. It is merely the first act of a much greater tragedy." Click. The documents and Judith's video vanished. In their place, excerpts from my mother's letter appeared, her handwriting magnified, haunting everyone. "Julian says I'm sick because I'm suspicious of his business dealings. He has convinced me that I'm imagining things, that I'm paranoid. Today he told me that if I don't stop investigating, he'll have to take action for my own good." With each sentence that appeared on the screen, I narrated the story of how my mother, Beatrice, discovered the original crime, and how, to silence her, my father didn't kill her. He did something far worse. He convinced her, and the world, that she was crazy. I told the story of the doctors, the diagnoses, the isolation. I connected the financial crime to the crime of the soul. I showed them the anatomy of the monster. The silence in the hall was different now. It was not a silence of expectation. It was a silence of horror, a silence of judgment. "Everything I have shown you tonight," I said, my voice low but cutting through the air, "is part of a complete dossier, a dossier that, along with additional evidence and the sworn testimony of Ms. Adler, was encrypted and sent, exactly 10 minutes ago, to the editors of the country's major newspapers and to a financial crimes task force at the district attorney's office. There is no stopping it. There is no covering it up. Checkmate." I looked at the front row, at the man who gave me life and who tried to steal my sanity. He no longer looked like a king. He looked like a naked man, exposed under the cruelest light imaginable. I lowered my gaze to the microphone, and my voice was almost a whisper, but every word was a hammer blow. "This is not the end of your legacy, Father. It is its true unveiling. In her name, in the name of Beatrice." I switched off the microphone. The hissing sound of it powering down was the loudest thing in the room. Without looking at anyone, I turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the end of the world. My descent from the stage was the longest walk of my life. Each step on the carpeted stairs seemed to take an eternity. The silence in the ballroom was a physical entity, a vacuum that sucked all the air, all the sound. 1,000 eyes followed me, but I saw no one. It was like walking on the ocean floor, the pressure crushing. The faces around me twisted into silent masks of shock. I walked past the head table. I walked past him. I didn't look at him. I sat down in my chair, picked up my linen napkin, and placed it in my lap. An act of normality so absurd it felt like a scream. The spell was broken by a small, almost comical sound. A waiter, frozen in the middle of the room, dropped a dessert spoon from his tray. The sharp clink on the marble floor was like a starting pistol. The first reaction was his. Julian shot to his feet, his chair scraping back with a violent screech. His face was a blank canvas, his eyes wide with pure disbelief. He tried to smile, a horrific spasm that twisted his lips. "Oh, come on," he said, his voice dangerously loud, trying to find a playful tone. "What kind of a joke is this, Claire? A bit dramatic, don't you think? She always did have an imagination." But no one laughed. No one smiled back. His gaze swept the room, searching for an ally, a friendly face, and found only a sea of horror and fascination. Reality hit him. This wasn't a nightmare. It was his epitaph, being read aloud. The denial shattered, and what emerged from beneath was a pure, primal rage. The mask of the civilized philanthropist disintegrated, revealing the cornered animal. "Lies!" he bellowed, the scream tearing through the silence. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "It's all lies. She's sick. Sick like her mother. Someone get this lunatic out of here." He took a step towards me, his body shaking, his face crimson. But two discreetly positioned security guards near our table moved to intercept him. They were my team, not his, a precaution that, unfortunately, proved necessary. Their calm but immovable gesture seemed to drain the fury from his body. The bellow turned into a desperate plea. He turned to the audience, to his court, to the men and women who owed their fortunes and careers to him. "Sergio, Albert, you've known me for 30 years. For God's sake, say something. You can't believe this." That's when his real death began. Not the physical death, but the social one, which for a man like him was infinitely worse. I saw Senator Sergio, who had dinner at our house every month, suddenly become fascinated by a loose thread on the tablecloth. I saw Albert, his vice president, the man he called a brother, stand up and walk swiftly towards the service exit without a backward glance. I saw faces turn away, gazes break. I saw decades of purchased loyalty evaporate in seconds. Every averted glance was a nail in his coffin. They weren't judging me. They were absolving themselves, distancing themselves from the contagion of his fall. In that instant, the media dam broke. A flash, then another, then 100. The sound of the cameras was like a machine gun. The journalists, previously contained in their designated area, surged forward like a pack of wolves. "Mr. Croft, are the accusations true? Claire, what other proof do you have? Is it true your wife was forcibly committed?" The questions hit him like stones. He staggered backward, collapsing heavily into his chair, his hands covering his face, not to shield himself from the lights, but from the shame. The king was naked, and the crowd, which once adored him, now devoured him. And me? I watched it all from a strangely calm place within myself. The storm I had created now raged around me, but in its eye, there was a profound silence. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I felt the hollow relief of a debt finally paid, the end of a war that had lasted my entire life. I looked at the broken man in the chair, a father who became my enemy, and for the first time, I felt no hate. I felt a distant pity, the kind one feels for a great ancient tree that finally falls in the forest. The sound of its fall is deafening, but after it, there will be silence, and the sunlight can finally reach the forest floor. My work here was done. I stood up. No one stopped me. The chaos parted to let me through. I walked towards the grand doors of the ballroom, away from the noise, the carnage, my history. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. The sound of his world being torn to pieces was the only music that mattered. As I pushed open the doors and stepped into the silent hallway, a final image formed in my mind. The shocked faces of the audience, the exploding flashes. My father crumpled in his chair, and I realized the truth. In the silence that followed my bombshell, and in the chaos that came after, my mother's version, for the first time, was being heard, and my story, my real life, could finally begin. In the weeks that followed that night, the world outside was a hurricane. My name and my father's were in every newscast, on every magazine cover. The story unfolded in daily chapters of investigations, testimonies, and expert analyses. But inside my new small apartment, silence reigned. A silence that, for the first time in my life, was my own. It was not the silence of submission or fear. It was the silence of peace, the peace found on the other side of war. Society gave me a name, villain, the monstrous daughter, the heir of Macbeth. I read the articles, heard the commentary, and instead of being offended, I chose to accept the title, because my great lesson was understanding that sometimes the only way for a victim to be heard is for her to present herself to the world as a villain. For years, my silence was my prison. It was a silence built with the bricks of love, loyalty, and filial duty. Every secret I kept, every lie I upheld, was another brick in the wall that separated me from myself. This silence protected my father, but it poisoned me slowly. It allowed his narrative to become the only truth, for the lie about my mother to become history. I learned the hard way that passive silence is not neutrality. It is consent. It is complicity. It is allowing the monster to continue sharpening its claws under your own roof. The humiliation I suffered in his office was not what forged me. It was what freed me. That day, he didn't try to destroy me. He tried to recruit me. He offered me the same crown of thorns he placed on my mother's head, the same diagnosis of crazy, the same padded cell of false concern. He expected me to accept the role, to become the family's next tragedy, the next proof of his heroic patience. My great rebellion, my act of villainy, wasn't what I did on that stage. It was what I did inside myself, in that moment. It was the simple, silent, and unshakable refusal to bleed for him. It was the decision that my mother's legacy of pain would end with me. The lesson I learned is not about revenge. Revenge is a hot, chaotic emotion. What I did was cold, methodical. It was an expungement. It was the removal of a cancer that threatened to consume everything. I learned that self-love sometimes requires acts of apparent cruelty. It requires you to amputate a part of your life, even if that part is your own family, so that the rest of you can survive. I learned that boundaries are not suggestions. They are survival instincts. And when someone crosses your boundaries repeatedly, it is not your duty to teach them respect. It is your duty to remove them from your life in the most definitive way possible. I have no regrets, but I am not naive. I know the price of what I did. I lost a father, even though he was long lost to me. I lost the name, the status, the story I was told about who I was. I am an outcast in the world I grew up in. Peace has a cost, and it is often high. Justice is not a balm that heals all wounds. It is a surgical act that leaves scars, and I wear mine, not with shame, but as a map of the territory I crossed to find myself. Today, when the sun comes through my kitchen window, it doesn't illuminate Persian rugs or works of art. It illuminates a simple wooden table, a cup of coffee, and my own hands, which no longer shake. True freedom wasn't destroying his empire. It was building my own small, unshakable kingdom of peace, a kingdom of one, where the only voice that makes the rules is my own. And that is a lesson that no empire, no fortune, and no father can teach. While I was finding my peace, the world I left behind continued to burn in the flames of the truth I lit. My peace was bought with his war, and the war, for Julian, was total and annihilating. The dossier I sent to the district attorney's office was an atomic bomb. The investigations that followed were relentless. Fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. The financial crimes were the tip of an iceberg of decades of corruption. He wasn't arrested immediately. Men like my father rarely are. Instead, he was sentenced to a slower death. Death by 1,000 legal cuts. His assets were frozen, his accounts investigated. He, who once moved the world with a phone call, now spent his days in interrogation rooms and meetings with expensive lawyers who bled what remained of his fortune. But his true punishment didn't come from the courts. It came from the silence. The society that built him up was the same one that buried him. The friends who crowded his home now crossed the street to avoid him. Clubs expelled him. Charities returned his donations. He became a pariah, a ghost wandering the empty halls of his mansion, haunted not by spirits, but by the memories of a power he would never have again. The king was in exile, and his kingdom was a prison of luxury and solitude. The greatest torture for a narcissist is not the world's hatred, but its indifference. The world simply moved on and forgot him. The company, the Great Croft Empire, did not survive him. To save itself from the sinking ship, the board acted with the speed of a predator. In an emergency meeting, my father was stripped of all his positions. The company's name was changed. The brand he had spent his life building was erased in a matter of weeks. To contain the Judith Adler scandal, the new board offered her a multi-million-dollar settlement and a public apology, acknowledging her foundational contributions in the company's early days. His legacy, the thing he prized most, turned to dust. Judith sent me a letter, written by hand. It said only, "Thank you. Now Beatrice can rest." Justice for her wasn't in the money, but in the restoration of truth, and she, finally, was at peace. And me, I vanished. I used the resources I had prepared to start over, far from everything and everyone. I took my mother's maiden name, Adler. I lead a life that the world that judged me would consider insignificant. But in this insignificance, I have found a purpose that power never gave me. I founded anonymously a small institute, not a foundation with a name on a marble plaque, but a silent action group that offers free legal counsel to women who are being silenced, women in situations of psychological and financial abuse, women the system calls crazy, unstable, and hysterical. I can't save the world, but I can give a few women the same weapon I found. The truth. It is the only monument Beatrice ever deserved. A few days ago, I went back to the cemetery. The cold marble headstone was still there, but something had changed. I had a new inscription added. Below beloved wife, it now reads, Beatrice Adler, mother, visionary, the truth restored. I didn't bring flowers. Flowers die. Instead, I placed a single folded sheet of paper on the stone. A copy of the court judgment granting Judith the recognition she was owed. A piece of paper, a symbol of justice. There was no thunder in the heavens. There was no sign. Justice, when it arrives decades late, doesn't celebrate with fanfares. It arrives with the quietness of a breeze, with the relief of a burden finally set down. And there, in the silence of that afternoon, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The legacy of pain was over. The story had been rewritten. My mother was finally free, and therefore so was I. You have followed my story. You saw the act that shocked the world, the humiliation that shaped me in the darkness, and the strategy that brought me to the light. You heard the version the press hastily labeled, the one my father screamed in his desperation, and now you have heard mine, the other side of the story. They called me a monster, and perhaps from a certain point of view they are right. To expose the king hiding in the shadows, I had to become the queen of darkness. For every lie he used to build his castle, I needed a truth sharp enough to demolish it. For every door he locked to silence my mother, I had to break down the wall. I did not play by his rules. I set the board on fire. I do not ask for your acquittal, nor your forgiveness. I don't regret what I did, only the time it took me to find the courage to do it. I have presented you with the facts as I lived them. I presented the pain that became my fuel, and the justice that became my map. I showed you the exact moment when loyalty becomes complicity, and love becomes a chain. Now, the case is in your hands, my jury, and the question I ask you is not whether I am a hero or a villain. That is too easy a distinction, too comfortable. My question is deeper. When the justice system fails, when power and money buy silence and rewrite history, to whom does the duty of seeking the truth fall? To what extent does loyalty to a family justify the annihilation of one's own soul? And the final question, the most important of all, where exactly does the victim end and the monster she had to become to finally be free? Leave your verdict in the comments. Every comment is a vote in this court, the only one that truly matters. Your sentence is not just about me. It is about the silent rules that govern our own lives. And if you believe that every story has more than one side, and that often the most crucial one is the one that was buried, subscribe to the channel, because there are many other defendants like me, waiting to present their cases to this jury.